Well, good afternoon and welcome back. This is Patrick Little, and my offline recording seemed to have vanished for this audiobook thus far, so I'm going to be restarting at the beginning of chapter 1, and I'm going to uh, go ahead and make sure that my offline recording isn't just recording but also being saved properly somewhere. So we're going to continue on with Sir Archibald Ramsay's The Nameless War. Let me just make sure it's live streaming. Yep, the live stream is working. And I'm going to start my offline recording here. So, I'm going to play here an appendix that was. I'm going to play an appendix here that was left out from chapter 1 later. That was referring to the limits on Jewry, those laws passed, the first appendix referenced in this book. I'll play that later, though. So we're going to continue on with chapter 1, the British Revolution. And by the way, I read through page 3 of this before, but we're going to go ahead and just start with chapter 1 here because last time was so interrupted and I need to do my offline recording again, which I'm starting my offline recording now, verifying that it's going. Okay, this time it's saving to an audio file, and so chapter 1, The British Revolution. It was fated that England should be the first in a series of revolutions which is not yet finished, is the end quote. With these cryptic words, Isaac Disraeli, father of Benjamin, Earl of Beaconsfield, commenced his two-volume Life of Charles I, published in 1851. Benjamin Disraeli was the first ethnic Jew who achieved high governmental status. He was a prime minister in the 19th century of Britain. This was after 200 years of Britain's enslavement by the Jew Bank of England. He was a lot like Chomsky. He pretended at times to be critical of Jewish power, but really he just thought there was a best method of going about having Jewish power. And so he gives the beginnings of red pills in his book that he wrote on the history of Charles I, published in 1851. And we're going to go into this more here. Moving on. With these cryptic words, Isaac Disraeli, father of Benjamin, Earl of Beaconsfield, commenced his two-volume Life of Charles I, published in 1851. A work of astonishing detail and insight, much information for which, he states, was obtained from the records of one Melchior de Salem, French envoy in England during that period. The scene opens with distant glimpses of the British kingdom based upon Christianity in its own ancient traditions. These sanctions binding monarchy, church, state, nobles, and the people in one solemn bond on the one hand, and on the other hand, the ominous rumblings of Calvinism. And we're going to find out shortly Calvin's an ethnic Jew, a crypto-Jew, trying to sow division in Europe, and targeted specifically Britain. Moving on. Calvin, who came to Geneva from France, where his name was spelt Cowan, a French effort to spell Cohen, organized great numbers of revolutionary orators, not a few of whom were inflicted upon England and Scotland. And this is proven by a document at a B'nai Brit. This is the first footnote of chapter 1. Footnote number 2. At a B'nai Brit meeting in Paris, reported in Catholic Gazette in February 1936, he was claimed to be of Jewish extraction. So the B'nai Brit, the founders of the ADL, claimed that Cowan or Calvin was a Jew. So this is straight from one of the most powerful Jewish organizations' mouths in a meeting behind closed doors. So Calvin was almost certainly an ethnic Jew, a crypto-Jew. And if you remember the proclamation from the Prince of the Jews at Byzantium in the 15th century, it is the duty of all Jews to subvert their host nations, to infiltrate churches and sow division so that the Jews may take control of the societies and kill the aristocracies that hadn't given the Jews free reign over the people to enslave them, as they had in Egypt and other places in the past. The scene opens with distant glimpses. Oh, yeah, I already read that one. Calvin, who came to Geneva from France, where his name was spelt Cowan, possibly a French effort to spell Cohen, organized a great number of revolutionary orators, not a few of whom were inflicted upon England and Scotland. Thus was laid the groundwork for revolution under a cloak of religious fervor. God, I just want to start reading E. Michael Jones now, but I'll skip that for now. On both sides of the Tweed, these demagogues contracted all religion into rigid observance of the Sabbath. And you have to remember, if you read the protocols, if you read if you read any of the writings from Professor Dr. Kevin MacDonald, this is how the Jews do. They figure out a way to get in institutions and subvert them and cause infighting and create kind of like patriarchal cults of personality like Boaz, and I'd say Boaz and Freud in the 19th and 20th centuries were the equivalent of Calvin then in the 16th century. This is designed to infiltrate and destroy institutions. In the former case, academia and the institutions of the West that were scholarly and scientific, and in the former case, in the latter case here, he's referring, of course, to Protestant churches. Luther had made it very clear, he who founded Protestant Christianity, as well as many of the popes, almost every pope before him in Catholicism, laid out that Jews will try to subvert the church. And so once Luther was gone from the scene, this is the Jews' attempt to subvert, and divide and conquer, quite successfully, I might add, Protestantism and hijack it. So, this high psychological intensity preaching and demagoguery used to incite revolution, much like Bolshevism, Leveillerism, the Reign of Terror in France, etc. This is all the same thing. Jewish psychological identity and Jews hiding the fact that they're ethnic Jews, pretending to be something they're not, whether they're pretending to be Bolsheviks, pretending to be egalitarians, pretending to be libertines in France. The same thing continues throughout history. Jews disguise their own terrorist tyrannical interests of enslavement of the Goyim under the guise of universal good and universal revolution, usually guised in egalitarianism. So we're moving on here. I'm sorry if I'm making so much commentary. I'm going to cut down on the commentary. On both sides of the Tweed, these demagogues contracted all religion into a rigid observance of the Sabbath. To use the words of Isaac Disraeli, quote, "The nation was already divided into Sabbatarians and Sabbath breakers. Calvin," states Disraeli, "deemed the Sabbath to be a Jewish ordinance limited to the sacred people." So this is him inserting Judaism into Protestant Christianity. He goes on to say that when these Calvinists held the country in their power, quote, "it seemed that religion chiefly consisted of Sabbatarian rigors, and that a British Senate had been transformed into a company of Hebrew rabbins." In other words, they turned the governmental structure into like a Jewish oligarchy, and the people in the government were acting like the Jews do now with their Shabbat enforcers on Saturdays in Israel. And later, in quote, "in 1650, after the execution of the king, an act was passed inflicting penalties for a breach of the Sabbath." End quote. Buckingham, Strafford, and Laud are the three chief figures round the king in these early stages, men on whose loyalty to himself, the nation, and the ancient tradition Charles can rely. So these were kind of like his right-hand men. And you're going to see how the men around the king were divided and conquered from the king and subverted or imprisoned or killed as a way of weakening the king. So Jewish divide and conquer. Buckingham, the trusted friend of King James I and of those who had saved his life at the time of the Gowrie conspiracy of ominous Kabbalistic associations, was associated in the early years of King Charles's reign under mysterious circumstances. Strafford, who had been in his early days inclined to follow the opposite faction, later left them and became a staunch and devoted adherent of the king. This opposition faction became steadily more hostile towards Charles, and Charles being the King of England who wanted to keep the Jews out. And by the time they were led by Pym and decided to impeach Strafford. So you see, they go after the people who were helping to keep the king in power, to keep the Jews out. Quote, "The king," writes Disraeli, quote, "regarded this faction as his enemies, and he states that the head of this faction was the Earl of Bedford. Walsh, the eminent Catholic historian, states that a Jew wine merchant named Roussel was the founder of this family in Tudor times." So in other words, crypto-Jews are leading this thing to take down the indigenous elite that was protecting the peasants and the lower nobles from Jewish exploitation. For 300 years, the kings of England had enforced the ban of Jews from England. and you're going to see how a crypto Jew did his bit to undermine while Cromwell came funded by Jew bankers and Jew synagogues in Holland, identified earlier in the book along with Switzerland as Jewish strongholds for the export of intrigue and subversion. This is heavy stuff, I know, but this is very condensed. I have to unpack a lot of this for you. So basically, this Roussel family led the opposition, and they were crypto Jews, wine merchants that had evaded ejection and expulsion from Great Britain or England via crypsis, as Dr. Kevin MacDonald talks about often in his books, how the Jews use crypsis to infiltrate closed societies and then open them up to Jewish exploitation. With the impeachment and execution of Strafford, the powers behind the rising Calvinist or Cohenist, I like that, Cohenist instead of Calvinist, conspiracy began to reveal themselves and their focus, the City of London. This, of course, became the International Jewry's headquarters of private central banking for quite some time, and arguably is still to this day. At the time, there suddenly began to appear from the city, and that's referring to the City of London, armed mobs of so-called operatives, the medieval equivalent for workers, no doubt. So he's making an allusion to the parallel between this Leveller's revolution and operatives and the Bolshevik revolution and the proletariat or workers. Let me quote Disraeli. Quote, "They were said to amount to 10,000 with warlike weapons. It was a militia for insurgency at all seasons, and might be depended upon for any work of destruction at the cheapest rate. As these sallied forth with daggers and bludgeons from the city, the inference is obvious that this train of explosion might have been long laid." So in other words, the Jews had been working to stoke up people behind the scenes, just as the Jews had been trying to incite the proletariat, so to say, in Bolshevik Russia for 20, 30 years via means of social democracy and things like that, towards the aim of a Bolshevist revolution where they'd be useful idiots for the killing of the people that had been trying to limit Jewish exploitation of the common man. So, in other words, he's saying they were long prepared this revolution, and it was at least 10,000 strong, and they were extremely violent. You know, writ Antifa, writ any communist or Bolshevik revolution in the 20th century in Europe, writ the Bauernaufstand of 1848, that the German nobles were actually able to subdue by giving rights to the workers and the farmers, etc., etc., and writ the Jacobins and such, or Jacobites in France during the Reign of Terror. Useful idiots being violent, doing the bidding of the Jews and destroying the existing power structure that limited Jewish power. So this book is intended for people that already know history, so I'm going to have to fill in some blanks for you here. My apologies. If I get verbose, that's my style. Moving on. It must indeed, referring to the tracks for this revolution long having been laid by these crypto Jews. And we must recollect here that at this time Strafford was still unexecuted, and civil war in the minds of none but those behind the scenes, who evidently had long since resolved upon and planned it. These armed mobs of workers intimidated all and sundry, included both House of Parliament and the palace at critical moments, exactly on the model employed later by the sacred bands and the Marseillaise in the French Revolution. So he's drawing parallel to another later Jewish revolution that appeared as a universalist revolution when it was really designed to put Jews in power, which is exactly what happened in England, and exactly what happened in France, and exactly what happened in the Bolshevik revolutions of Europe, including the 1917 revolution in Russia, and later the rest of the Slavic territories in Central Europe. Isaac Disraeli draws again and again startling parallels between this and the French Revolution, notably in his passages on the press, the media, quote, no longer under restraint in the deluge of revolutionary pamphlets and leaflets. Quote, from 1640 to 1660, he writes, quote, about 30,000 appeared to have started up, and he's referring to, of course, these Jewish propaganda pamphlets, And later, quote, "The collection of French revolutionary pamphlets now stands by the side of the French tracts of the age of Charles I, as abundant in number and as fierce in passion." So, in other words, he's saying that Jews started up a bunch of propaganda. Back then, propaganda was anyone with a printing press or anyone who could scribe out a bunch of pamphlets. And so this was the Jews using the printing press to weaponize propaganda for incitement against the existing order that had limits on Jewish power. And the same thing happened in Britain as later happened during the Reign of Terror, as commented on by Sir Edmund Burke, in France in the late 18th century. So he goes on, and he's talking about Disraeli. So basically, Sir Archibald Ramsay is talking about, he's filling in the gaps between the citations from the the two-volume series that Disraeli wrote in the 19th century about the Jewish subversion of the time in the time of the Levelers Revolution of the 1640s and the parallels to the French Revolution. He goes on, "Whose hand behind the curtain play the strings could post up a correct list of 59 commoners, branding them with the odious title of Stratfordians or betrayers of their country." Yeah. So the propagandists, the Jews that had the propaganda rags, were demonizing the people that stood between the Jews and taking control of power. So, and it goes on. But whose hand indeed? But Disraeli, who knew so much, now discreetly draws a veil over that iron curtain, and it is left to us to complete the revelation. To do so, we must turn to such other works as the Jewish Encyclopedia, Sombart's work, The Jews and Modern Capitalism, and others. So in other words, Disraeli is writing in general about revolutionaries, whereas kind of the way that Ben Shapiro might talk about the left or something. And so then Sir Archibald Ramsay is going in Dr. Kevin MacDonald style and filling in the gaps of the who's who and what's really going on, quoting from Jewish sources. So, of course, Disraeli, the ethnically Jewish prime minister of Britain in the 19th century, was writing for the Goyim, not writing for Jews. So Sir Archibald Ramsay, much in the style of Dr. David Duke and Dr. Kevin MacDonald, had to go to the Jewish sources written for Jewish eyes to fill in the blanks so that the Goy might finally realize what was really going on with these revolutions, cui bono, who was really benefiting, and who was behind it. From the Jewish World Encyclopedia and the Jews and Modern Capitalism, we learn that Cromwell, the chief figure of the revolution, was in close contact with the powerful Jew financiers in Holland, and was in fact paid large sums of money by Mansa ben Israel, whilst Fernandez Carvajal, the so-called Great Jew, as he was called, was the chief contractor of the New Model Army. In The Jews in England, we read, quote, 1643 brought a large contingent of Jews to England. Their rallying point was the house of the Portuguese ambassador de Souza, a Marrano, or a crypto-Jew that had concealed his Jewish ethnicity by embracing ostensibly Catholicism. So, once again, we have a crypto-Jew here being the conduit through which these revolutionary Jews are pouring in. Nothing ever changes with these Jews, unfortunately. Prominent among them was Ferdinand Karayevel, a great financier and army contractor. In January of the previous year, the attempted arrest of the 5 members had set in violent motion the armed gangs of operatives, which is, you got to remember, that's like the Red Army of the time, already mentioned, from the city of London, that is. Revolutionary pamphlets were broadcasted on this occasion, as Disraeli tells us, quote, bearing the ominous insurrectionary cry of, "To your tents, O Israel," end quote. Jesus Christ. This reminds me a lot of Dr. Kevin MacDonald's Culture of Critique. Anyhow, shortly after this, the king and the royal family left the palace of Whitehall. The five members with armed mobs and banners accompanying them were given a triumphal return to Westminster. The stage was now set for the advent of Carahall and his Jews and the rise of their creature Cromwell. So the Jews established a revolutionary beachhead, and just as Lenin and Trotsky were welcomed in as heroes, and of course they're coming from Switzerland and New York on a secret train bringing them in to be the heads of the revolution, here the Jewish beachhead was established with a 10,000 man strong army led and funneled in by crypto Jews, laying out the red carpet for the arrival of their chief orator and their chief leader, and Shabbos Goy, Oliver Cromwell, who's basically going to now be the Goyish face of the Jewish takeover of Britain. The scene now changes. The Civil War, so that left off talking about 1643. So the scene, okay. The scene now changes. The Civil War has taken its course. The year is 1647. Naseby has been won and lost. The king is virtually a prisoner. While treated as an honored guest at Hombley House, according to a letter published in plain English on the 3rd September 1921, quote, "The learned elders have been in existence for much longer period than any have perhaps suspected. My friend Mr. L.D. van Valkert of Amsterdam has recently sent me a letter containing 2 extracts from the synagogue at Mulheim." So basically, you'll notice the parallel here. At first, the czars were also treated nicely, and then they were eventually moved to a basement, where they were then executed between the basement and the cave, or in the yard between the basement and the cave, where their bodies were dumped into Jewish ritual murder. So it's the same thing here. They come for the king's head, but at first they're kind of making it look like he's being treated well. So referring then to the letters from the synagogues at Mulheim, the correspondence to the Jews leading the revolution and the Shabbos Goyim leading the revolution in Britain, 1647. The volume in which they are contained was lost at some period during the Napoleonic Wars and has recently come into Mr. von Falkert's possession. So these letters between the Jews and their Shabbos Goyim and crypto Jews in England was uncovered in 1921 again. It was written in German and contains extracts of letters sent and received by the authorities of the Mulheim synagogue. The first entry he sends me is of a letter received. 16th June, 1647, from Oliver Cromwell, by Ebenezer Pratt. Okay. In return for financial support, will advocate admission of Jews to England. This, however, impossible while Charles living. So these are truncated messages, you'll notice. They're leaving out some helper verbs and stuff. Charles cannot be executed without trial, adequate grounds for which do not at present exist. Therefore advise that Charles be assassinated, but will have nothing to do with arrangements for procuring an assassin, though willing to help in his escape. So he's saying basically, let's arrange for it to look like someone's offering to help King Charles escape, and then use the attempted escape as an excuse to execute King Charles. This is very fucking Jewish, pardon my French. My God, these are some clever bastards. And then the 12th of July, 1647, less than a month later, to Oliver Cromwell by E. Pratt. And of course, that's coming from Ebenezer in Holland. Will grant financial aid as soon as Charles removed and Jews admitted. Assassination too dangerous. Charles shall be given opportunity to escape. His recapture will make trial and execution possible. To support will be liberal, but useless to discuss terms until trial commences. End quote. So, in other words, yes, plan to entrap King Charles into an excuse to execute him by giving him an escape attempt. Approved. And your money's going to come to secure power in Britain as soon as you secure the open admittance of Jews into the country. So this was quid pro quo. do whatever the Jews want, and then they'll give you the power to rule over the Goyim as a Shabbos Goy. This sounds like what Trump did. With this information now at our disposal, the subsequent moves on the part of the regicides now stand out with new clearness. Regicides are people that commit murder against kings and royalty. Cromwell himself, according to Disraeli, unknown even to General-in-Chief Fairfax, descended upon Holmby House with 500 picked revolutionary troopers and seized the king. According to Disraeli, quote, the plan was arranged on May 30th at a secret meeting held at Cromwell's house, though later Cromwell pretended that it was without his concurrence, end quote. So basically this was planned at Cromwell's house, but he's going to later deny any connection to it. This move coincided with a sudden development in the army, the rise of the, quote, levelers and, quote, rationalists. Their doctrines were those of the French revolutionaries. In fact, what we know today as communism. These were the regicides, who 4 times purged Parliament till there was left finally 50 members, communists like themselves, known later as the Rump. So this is exactly like the rototilling of the ruling elite that happened in France. They, wave after wave, they killed aristocrats until finally they killed their own useful idiots that had brought in the Jews to power, until finally, before Napoleon comes on the scenes, only Jews had power during the Reign of Terror. This is exactly like the 20 years leading up to Russians starting to then begin purging Jews from the head of the Soviet Union, and Russian nationalism reemerged as Jewish overrepresentation was cut down on, and Jewish internationalists were then purged or executed in the Soviet Union in the 1940s and 1950s, and arguably starting in the 1930s. So this is the same pattern, the same exact damn pattern. To return to the letter from Mulheim Synagogue of the 12th June 1647, and its cunning suggestion that attempted escape should be used as a pretext for execution, and of course they're referring to an execution of the king, who would not let the Jews back into England after 300 years of keeping his people safe from the presence of Jews, although there were some crypto-Jews that he didn't realize were still there. Just such an event took place on 12th November of that year. Hollis and Lidlov consider that the flight as a stratagem of Cromwell's. Isaac Disraeli states, quote, contemporary historians have decided that the king, from the day of his deportation from Holmby to his escape to the Isle of Wight, was throughout the dupe of Cromwell. So in other words, this whole time the king is being led on an escape route, like an underground railroad to freedom. The whole time he's being led by servants of the Jews that were just, putting on a show escape so that they could then execute King Charles without an execution, without a trial. That the trial would now be not for the crime of having kept Jews out of the country, but the crime of having tried to escape the revolutionary government. Very clever. Very friggin' clever. Remember, Goyim who know about Jewish power and speak about it, remember, entrapment is a constant factor. If they can't get you on thought crime, they'll try and entrap you with some other sort of crime. Moving on. Little more remains to be said. Cromwell had carried out the orders from the synagogue, and now it only remained to stage the mock trial. Maneuvering for position continued for some time, and it became apparent that the House of Commons, even in their partially purged condition, were in favor of coming to an agreement with the king. On 5th December 1648, the House sat all night and finally carried the question, quote, that the king's concessions were satisfactory to a settlement, end quote. Uh-oh. They didn't purge enough people loyal to England from the government, from the parliament, so there's going to have to be another night of the long knives to kill off the people that aren't full-blown servants of the Jews. And that's about to be mentioned here. Should such an agreement have been reached, of course, Cromwell would not have received the large sums of money which he was hoping to get from the Jews. He struck again. On the night of December the 6th, Colonel Pryd, on his instructions, carried out the last and most famous purge of the House of Commons, known as Pryde's Purge. On 4th January, the communist remnant of 50 members, the Rump, invested themselves with the, quote, the supreme authority, end quote. So in other words, Cromwell and his Jew assassins just kept on killing people that were voting against executing the king until they had a majority. And this communist body that was left after the killing of all the people that were really loyal to England and loyal to the king and loyal to the commoners that wanted to keep the commoners from being exploited by the Jews, wanted to keep the Jews out of the country, they were purged until, of course, the Jews invented their majority, or rather, murdered their way to a majority. And the Shabbos Goyim Cromwell got his money. Unbelievable. Nothing ever changes. If you are not right now, close your eyes. Picture the same thing happening with all of the aristocrats, all of the Christian priests, and all of the Christians that wouldn't embrace communism. Close your damn eyes real quick. Being killed in front of their churches, the churches all being burned down, the Jews raping all of the Christians' wives, 30 to 50 million people killed, the czars being executed on pretense, and it being a ritual Jewish murder. Imagine then, by stealth, the Jew bankers financing the triumphant arrival of Lenin and Trotsky into then the revolutionary former Russian state. If you don't see this as the same exact thing that happened in 1640s England, and the same exact thing that happened during the Reign of Terror in the 1790s, where it is purge after purge after purge, where the government becomes more and more and more Jewish, more and more Zionist, then you're missing the point here, and you need to go back and listen to whatever I've already read. It's the same thing over and over again. Moving on. On 9th of January, in other words, after the last purge of those people that maintained a pro-English, anti-Jewish majority in the parliament, on 9th January, at a High Court of Justice, in other words, a show trial for the Jews, to try the king was proclaimed. 2/3 of the members were levelers from the army, levelers being, of course, the word for Bolsheviks in 1647. They were called at many times many different things. Anyhow. They're ultra-egalitarians, and these people are useful idiots to kill the people that were in leadership prior to the Jews taking of power. Algernon Sidney warned Cromwell, quote, "First, the king can be tried by no court. Second, no man can be tried by this court," end quote. So writes Hugh Ross Williamson in his Charles and Cromwell. And he adds a finishing touch to the effect that, quote, "no English lawyer could be found to draw up the charge, which was eventually entrusted to an accommodating alien, Isaac Deserlaus, a Jew." So, in other words, they couldn't even find an Englishman to be the prosecutor against the king. They had to find some Jew from overseas to be the attorney. Just like they couldn't find an American to be the tyrannical chief of Homeland Security like we had under that Shabbos bastard guy Bush Jr. And they had to bring in a fucking citizen of Israel, yeah, that's right, Michael fucking Chertoff, to oversee the implementation of tyranny in the United States and the destruction of the Bill of Rights. They had to bring in a goddamn foreign Jew. I'm going to take a break here. I need a cigarette. The fire rises. I'm going to take a little break here while I chew on this massive fucking red pill that I've just read aloud. All right, and I'm back. I'm going to restart the offline recording. I'm just seeing briefly here. I haven't been looking at the chat here, but it looks like we've got a lot of people talking about stuff that is not related to the book. If you're not talking about the book, if you're not talking about the historical references I'm making, you're counterproductive, and I need you to shut up and stop typing, because I'm not going to be responsible for policing the chat. You guys, I mean, they're got probably 50 Jews in the chat posting all sorts of retarded sounding stuff, pretending to be white nationalists or pretending to be woke whatevers. But focus. I'm begging you, focus on what you're talking about. Otherwise, why the hell are you here other than try and make it look like a bunch of crap? All right. I'm getting sick of this. I mean, I'm giving